When we think of art theft, you probably immediately have images of Ocean's 12 or the Thomas Crown affair that come to mind. Nothing could be further from the actual truth of this international industry, which is detailed beautifully in this book, Hot Art, Chasing Thieves and Detectives Through the Secret World of Stolen Art, coming to us from Canada, I believe. Joshua, it's Knelman, is that the...
It is Knelman. It's a silent K.
We got the silent K there. Joshua, thank you so much for joining us here on today's show, and thank you for writing this book. Now, you're an investigative journalist. It is a great piece of work. How long did it take you to do all the work to write this?
Well, it's a good question. The work really started in 2003 when I wanted to write a very short piece about a local burglary here at an art gallery in Toronto. And it sort of spun from there. So the last 4.5 years, I've worked other side jobs, and then I've traveled to various places to try and interview a series of detectives, and in one case, very savvy former art thief in the UK, who could get at some of the big picture stuff in terms of how the black market actually works. So when you look at the timeline that way, 2003 to 2011. For anyone out there researching and writing a book, I recommend trying to cut down on that research time.
Yeah, and did you have were you a reporter in the meantime? You had to eat. This took forever.
I've been doing various things. I was an editor at the Walrus magazine for 4.5 years, and so most of my time wasn't actually writing, it was helping other writers research and so forth. So all sort of in that field. And then once in a while I'll come up with a feature on a given topic. So my background is really research and sort of helping to train other researchers at the magazine and so forth. Yeah. So
I'll try and explain to the viewers what's in this book, and really when you crack it open, and you can see my copy is very dog-eared. I don't usually do this, but there's so many cool things I wanted to remember to talk about. Right there at the front, there's a quote from Banksy: "The greatest crimes in the world are not committed by people breaking the rules, but by people following the rules." And it kind of sets the tone for the book, which I think is appropriate for that as the first quote. But you really follow two sides of an industry that I don't think people really know about it, because it's not the headlines. When a Van Gogh or a Rembrandt or a Matisse or something really big is stolen, then there's the headlines and, oh my goodness, someone stole a $100 million painting. But really, you have this I'll call him the knocker from Brighton. Yes. Paul, on the one hand, which is a character throughout the book, and then you have a Los Angeles police detective. His name was unpronounceable to me. It was Herchik?
It's Horisic.
Horisic, okay, Horisic, who is on the other side of this equation of a market that really is, as is quoted in the book, under the radar of just so much art being stolen, but it gets passed around the world, and then all of a sudden it's legitimate again, and then it gets purchased and it can get stolen again. How can I even detail what you've written about here in a couple of words?
Right, so really what you're looking at is what turns out to be this global game of hide and seek. And I think Paul actually, he has a great term that he coined for the blockbuster stuff that we see written about in newspaper headlines, which is, he calls it headache art.
Right.
And I think that one of the important points to make is that there's these different categories of the kinds of art that are stolen. And of course, headache art that's when you're talking about, a Van Gogh or Picasso being stolen from a museum, more frequently by groups of armed men, sometimes during visiting hours. And in those cases, of course, they're completely sensational and they get plastered all across the global media. And they're very important, obviously, in the sense that, we do not want armed groups of men running into our national institutions and stealing works of priceless genius. But under the radar, there are, of course, thousands and thousands of objects that are stolen from art galleries, from private residences, and it's these pieces that really don't get a lot of media attention. There's just too many of them being stolen to garner that kind of media attention. But those sorts of burglaries seem to point to a larger pattern here that involves both, the criminals, but also the legitimate art market, which is, of course, a completely unregulated and fully globalized market. And it perfectly sort of piggybacks the black market. So you're looking at objects that could be stolen in Los Angeles and sold to an art dealer in London or in Canada, for example. And these things just happen very quietly, almost invisibly. And that's really, those are 95% of cases of art theft, are these lesser valued items, under $100,000, under $20,000. And when they're stolen, they can pop up anywhere in the world. And of course, unless someone is diligent about posting photos of them online and contacting places like the Art Loss Register and making sure that their items are registered with Interpol, it's very hard for people to keep track of where these items are going and how they're being bought and sold.
But it also seems like there is no desire to act, because you said it's an unregulated market, which is quite interesting, because you see there's so much regulation in so many other items of value in the world, but not the art market. Right. Why is it that this has not become regulated, and will it ever?
That's a great question, and I think that that's something that the art market is going to have to contend with as more and more cases like this come into public light. But of course, as a few people who were interviewed in the book pointed out, no market that is unregulated wants to be regulated.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, I mean, when you're looking at it that way, no market is going to be regulated unless you force regulations upon them. And this comes up, of course, in like all these different areas in the story when you're talking to former thieves like Paul, who completely exploited the unregulated market, or great detectives like Don Harisic in Los Angeles, who, of course, when they started to learn about how the art market worked, were really interested in the fact that the business practices of the art market have not caught up to the age of information that we now live in.
What was astounding to me is that there is so little investigative power on, within the authorities and structures around the world. In fact, only really 2 guys in L.A. You've got like a small team, and you actually detail a lot of these people in the Scotland Yard. But yet, for this big of a market, why is it so just underrepresented by law enforcement?
Right. Well, it seems to me that there are a few different kinds of answers to that question, but of course, the first...
They're in on the game. That's what it's got to be. It's got to be completely in on it.
Well, I mean, I think that that's an area that more people are going to have to explore in terms of, getting in on the game. But certainly with some of these detectives, they're all entrepreneurs in a way, and they've had to be in order to create a space for themselves within their various organizations and departments. And what you're saying is true. There's very few investigators in North America or in the UK. The ones that are there are great, and they are really striving to learn more about how this works. And that was really the challenge in terms of starting to put together this book and research, was trying to pinpoint who those people were and spend some time getting to know them and learning about their learning curve. So the book really ended up being about the learning curves of, especially I focus on Don Harisic in Los Angeles and Paul in the UK. And the thing that interested me after a few months of interviewing both was that even though you're dealing with, in one case, a detective in Los Angeles, and in another case, an art thief in the United Kingdom, their learning curves had to be so similar. They were learning the same things in order to do their jobs properly. And in a sense, what they were learning was how the art market worked and how it could be exploited.
There's something cultural, I guess. As you look at the detectives who went through a lot of personal struggle and ridicule, quite honestly, just to set up their little mini departments to track down this, these huge just huge amounts of art being stolen. It's not just paintings, it's furniture, it's jewelry, it's artifacts, it's all kinds, anything you might find on Antiques Roadshow. In fact, many analogies made to the Antiques Roadshow throughout the book. But does this mean that culturally people just don't place the value on art, or there's something there that really bothered me? Because on one hand, when it comes to paintings, I'm very blasé. I'm like, well, at the end of the day, it's canvas with some oil stuff on it, and so whatever value someone wants to put on that is up to them. Right. But jewelry is quite different. Ancient artifacts is quite different. But do people just not see that as an important crime, the value that is associated with that? I mean, what did you find?
Well, I found that actually it seems that most people really do place a value on this, but they might not necessarily connect it to what we think of as art theft. So when you talk to people about people who have been burglarized, about what kind of items have been burglarized, if it's the difference between, say, a television being stolen, which can be replaced immediately, or, an heirloom that has been passed down through their family for generations, which really spoke to the cultural heritage of, their past, and which is, for them, irreplaceable. Of course, people are going to feel a lot more loss over that kind of object than something that has been manufactured by the millions, and can be basically an insurance form can be filled out, and presto, you have your television back, and you're watching your favorite crime dramas on TV. So,
CSI.
So on the broader perspective, I think that people really feel these losses when it happens to them. But of course, something that I found so interesting in terms of doing all these different kinds of interviews is that generally the public perception still seems to be sort of caught up when it comes to art theft with, movies like the Thomas Crown Affair, where people, for some reason, still see art theft as being only in the realm of the elite, and dealing with very few small objects that a very, the 1% actually covets. And of course, there is that aspect to it. But as you mentioned, and as the book detailed, there's also this giant undercurrent of global hide and seek, where you have thousands and thousands of objects that are being drained from people's private homes and collections. And we just don't have enough law enforcement at this moment to keep track of all those stolen items. So
yeah, it's really and all these, when you look at the Thomas Crown Affair, Ocean's 12, it's romanticized, and you kind of, the Hollywood has made it into this like Robin Hood kind of, we feel good for this guy, he's a thief, he's clearly stealing something, but right. We kind of sympathize with him somehow. And even in the early days of what you've chronicled, like, the guy just no bail, just get off and go home, and it's okay. And something was stolen, but it was returned, or the original owner had to buy it back, and the person who stole it still doesn't really get prosecuted. Right. There was one kind of sub story that I like very much, where the butler actually did it. I love that story. That tickled me pink.
Right, and that's actually a really that's a point that actually is something that comes up from both ends in North America and in the UK, and it comes up from various groups of detectives in both those places, which is that the inside job is something that occurs often in these sorts of crimes. And of course, when you're talking with various law enforcement agencies who deal with things like thefts from museums, that's a theme that comes up too. So, in a lot of these cases, you're dealing with things that are being stolen by people who do have inside information about, okay, how can I do this? What are the habits of this family are like? When are they going to go to bed? When won't they be there? When will they be on vacation, and so forth? And of course, that comes up a lot when you're dealing with someone like Paul, who, in a sense, started out not as an art thief, but as a knocker on the streets of Brighton. And of course, knocking meant that he really spent his days going
Casing the joint.
yeah, casing joints. It's kind of, for him, it was a beautiful business model because he's a very charming guy, very, very smart, knows, has fantastic people skills. And so he's there knocking on a door, and his whole modus operandi at that point was really just to get inside, just make pleasant conversation, get inside, and just have a look around. And the minute he can have a look around, well, suddenly that house becomes a target.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that, so Paul, very endearing character in the book, and in fact, many of these of the people you've encountered seem very willing to talk, quite openly about how it works and what they've done, and in some effect, it seems like they had a sense of pride about their work. Did you at any point feel like maybe you were being scammed by Paul as he was giving you all these details, or did everything just check out? Did you have any doubts whatsoever?
Well, I mean, with Paul, I spent a long time going over various details of his story. And of course, whenever you're dealing with any subject, you always have to take things with a grain of salt. But, his basic details did seem to check out. And of course, his story is something that I covered, I'd cover it once, 1 month, and then a couple months later, if I'm back over the details again, and so forth. So, that seemed to work, and he was completely consistent. And of course, the pattern that he talked about matched up with the various challenges that law enforcement were dealing with, both in the UK and in the US. So, it's a mirror, basically, in terms of looking at his career as an art thief and the experiences of these groups of detectives, both at the FBI, the LAPD, and Scotland Yard, and the sort of challenges that they said kept popping up. And of course, the biggest challenge in terms of law enforcement, and this came from all corners, was information. Finding information, trading information, and of course, starting from the basic premise that there just isn't enough information about this crime at the moment.
You give the reader a real broad view of all kinds of theft, really starting in the chronology of the ancient Egypt with the pyramids,
Yes.
but also some things that I think it was right you stayed on message and didn't expand into too deeply. I don't know if you're planning any follow-ups to this excellent piece of work, but to me the invasion in Iraq and the Iraqi National Museum and all the treasures that were stolen there, and of course a lot has been written about that, but I don't think people really consider it that much. And now we've seen this Arab Spring, and once again, the Egyptian National Museum, I believe, was looted. It seems like this could be a whole new book just by itself, talking about that side of the imperialistic wars that seem to be started.
Yes, and that's sort of, again, another side, a whole different side to this story, and a lot more research has to be done on it. And of course, in terms of you asking a follow-up, well, I think that, that's one of the nice things about getting a book out, is that it's then there for other people to use to follow up on. And of course, this subject is so big, and there's still so little known about it, that it would be great if a couple different journalists sort of took it up and started to explore different edges of it. But what you're talking about in terms of the invasion of Iraq and the looting of Iraq, and then Egypt, and of course, when you look at any country that has a wealth of cultural property, that especially when you're dealing with archaeological sites, are left unguarded. Unlike, for example, a painting, which may have a provenance, when you dig pieces straight out of the ground from an archaeological site, there's absolutely no record of them in existence. So that, of course, is a giant problem. And we know from the way that the black market works that those items are then, once they're extracted, they're really drawn to centers of the art world where the money is. It's sort of the old adage, you have to follow the money. So a piece from Iraq can end up in, for example, New York or London for sale, and there's no record of it, and it's probably moved through a number of different hands to get from Iraq to London or New York. And we know from certain cases in the book, it can just happen very quickly. So it can take a matter of weeks or a matter of months. But this is sort of another edge to the problem. And just like many of the thefts that are chronicled in the book, it can happen almost invisibly. And that's really, I think, one of the most insidious parts about the problem of art theft, which is that all of this can happen so quietly. And no one's the wiser. Business is done on a handshake, and then a piece ends up in a private collection for 20 years, and it's just gone. So it's as if these crimes never happen.
Not only that, but it's a great racket. It seems like a better racket than Wall Street. And oh, surprise, I bet you there's some overlap there in the actors in both of those rackets. It's very interesting. It seems like it also is a bit cyclical, the way the art world in general works. If you think about how you detail that, well, if you had the rich families and, the rich families die off and eventually stuff gets passed down to upper middle class, and then they really don't know what they have other than an heirloom that gets stolen by, perhaps a guy like Paul, and then,
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Right. And then, so now we have, let's say we have a real big financial bust, which is probably likely to happen. And we have all these billionaires who might start having to either sell off art or, that may decrease the value. How will that, I guess what I'm saying is, is there a real cyclical nature over decades or centuries to the amount of theft and value of art in general?
Well, I think one way of looking at that question, it's a great question, is that as we have different databases springing up that actually keep track of items that have been stolen. So there are efforts, for example, Interpol has a great database, the FBI has a great database, there's the Art Loss Register, which is a mammoth, giant private database. And as these databases continue to catalog items that are stolen, what that means is that there's actually, we are starting to have a global institutional memory that actually means that even if an object is stolen today, if it pops up, say, at an auction in 30 years, there will be a record that this object was actually stolen in 2012. Now, when we look at, if we go back in time a little bit, that wasn't necessarily the case. There wasn't this global institutional memory. There wasn't enough information for that to happen. So in terms of the cyclical nature, I think that in this crime, I think there's a lot of opportunity right now in terms of cataloging stuff that's stolen so that whether it's in 10 years or 30 years, when those items do actually go into the public sphere, somebody can say, aha, I know, I recognize that item. It was stolen 20 years ago.
Not that there will necessarily be any recourse or punishment for that, because someone may have purchased that quite legitimately, quote unquote, and well, you can't just come and confiscate that from me. I bought it from that guy.
Right. And so then that gets into the whole other sort of legal disputes that come up around these objects. But there was a really interesting case that made the news just here in Canada in the past year, where a sculpture turned up in the washroom of, I believe it was a hotel, and it was in a plastic bag, and there was a note attached. And basically the note said, this sculpture was stolen. And years ago, I mean, we're talking about decades gone by, and I'm returning it. This is stolen from. I can't use it anymore. And
this one's no good.
That to me was kind of an amazing case, because one explanation for that kind of return, again, in the public washroom, wrapped in a plastic bag, is that whoever was in possession of that stolen sculpture knew that it was stolen, but had kept it for years. And maybe they were getting to a point in life where, for example, they had to move into a retirement home, or they were sorting out their affairs, and they realized they did not want to pass this sculpture down to their sons or daughters.
Right.
For exactly the reason that we were talking about. Because if they decided at some point, we'd like to sell this at an auction house, it would become clear this item is stolen. So instead of being recycled through the art market, this person, whoever they were, decided, I'm going to leave this in a public washroom, and it will be returned. I love that attitude, and I wish that more people would follow.
Yeah, sure.
Just start returning stolen art. I think, and another interesting version of that is has to do with the recovery of items post looting of the National Museum in Baghdad, when Matthew Bogdanos took over that investigation, and he declared an amnesty period where he basically went out and communicated to all of the marketplace sellers in Baghdad that essentially people could just bring back items and there would be no punishment. Just return the items. And he had a great experience in certain senses because, that is exactly what happened. People started to actually send back items. In some cases, cars would drop off items to him. That system is one interesting mode of dealing with the volume of stuff that's stolen. I'm not suggesting that we just have an amnesty period where suddenly anyone who has stolen art can just return it. But it is one interesting way of dealing with this kind of problem.
There were just a couple other really interesting stories, stuff that you don't inherently just think about. The amount of art that was destroyed in the 9/11 disaster in New York, and some of that was actually recovered, which I did not know. And to note that Cantor Fitzgerald had 100 Rodin sculptures in their offices. There were just hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art. And some of it actually survived the collapse of the towers, and a lot of it may have disappeared.
Well, I think very few things did survive the collapse. I think that there were a couple of sculptures that were actually salvageable, but and of course that's a story. It's just a sad story all around, and it's a story that, of course, not a lot of reporting was done on because, and rightly so. I mean, the events of that day were really about the people.
Right.
But I thought it was interesting enough actually to mention the fact that those towers did contain massive amounts of artwork, of course, because you were dealing with some of the richest companies in the world who actually had the resources to have and collect fantastic artwork, and of course we'll never see that artwork again. And it was interesting to me that, of course, art was part of the original budget when the Port Authority built those buildings, which is a great thing. And I think that still happens when big new projects go up. I know I know that in Canada sometimes there are actually laws saying that, okay, you can build this giant skyscraper, but a certain amount of the budget has to go to public art. So that's the good news.
Yeah, you talk about probably the most stolen painting, Jacob van Gijn. But let me ask you to go on a limb. What do you think is the mother lode? What is the one that, from the romantic perspective, above the radar?
Right.
What is the one painting that maybe people spoke, or piece of art that people spoke about the most? Like that would be the one that would actually not even be about the value of it, but just to actually get it from that museum, to pull that one off would put me on the radar, on the map forever. Was there any of that from any of the people you interviewed?
Well, I think that everybody who I interviewed, it didn't matter what sector or what country they were from. Everybody who I interviewed is still right on the lookout for Vermeer's The Concert, which of course was stolen from the Gardner Museum in Boston. And there are just so many people who have tried to find that painting through various investigations and connections. A number of the different agents and detectives I'd talked to had spent time looking into that case. And if there's a painting that can be pulled back, of course, everybody wants to see The Concert back at the Gardner Museum where it should be. And that story in itself is actually incredible in the sense that, of course, where the concert used to hang, there's now an empty frame,
Right.
which has really become this beautiful and I think it's quite a poetic symbol of all art theft. Is this empty frame that hangs in the Gardner, and it sort of speaks volumes in the sense that it's empty. And again, for me, that's as much a sign of the painting as it is and became during my research about just how little we know still about this field. But
yeah, Joshua, what I realized is that I could talk to you about this for hours, because it seems like, although a nice, well-rounded piece, it seems like there's just so much more. In fact, I will tell you right now, if you want to get laid at the cocktail party, this is the book you want to read, because you will sound so awesome and exciting. Joshua Knelman's Hot Art: Chasing Thieves and Detectives Through the Secret World of Stolen Art. If you want to get your copy, just tap on the blue button if you're watching in the app, or click on the Amazon link on the page. Thank you for opening me up to this. My fiance actually has been in art for 2 decades, and as I was reading it, she literally said to me, I'm jealous that you're reading. I want to read this book. I'm jealous of you reading it right now. That's how good I really think it is. What do you do as a writer and investigative journalist from here? Do you continue looking at this? Are there other things that you want to explore? What are the plans?
Well, that's a great question. I think I have no immediate plans. I've been doing some, nice talks about the book and so forth, and it's been really interesting because whenever I address an audience, there's always somebody afterwards who walks up and says, "This was my experience. I had a piece of art stolen," or "I've heard about this." So, in terms of follow-up work, I think that as we talked about near the beginning of the interview, this is just sort of really my best sort of look at the edge of the problem. There's still so much more work to do. This is such an enormous criminal area, and thankfully there are lots of great people who I think are going to continue to investigate into this. But as you said, for example, like looting of cultural heritage from different countries around the world, including Iraq. Those are all stories that are ongoing, and they will take years to play out. So just like we need more great art detectives in training, I hope that more writers read these books about art theft, get interested, and go and do their own research. That's the best case scenario. Just get more information about this problem out there.
And we haven't even started to talk about counterfeits, which is a whole nother...
It's a whole other area.
Whole other rabbit hole.
Yes.
Yeah, and how about just artists stealing someone else's work and just making it their own? I mean, it's an incredible world. It really is.
It is. It is.
You can go to jail and you get billions of dollars in fines if you copyright someone's software code. Yeah, you can literally draw, like Picasso, well known for literally copying African art, and then, well, here it is, and now I'm making quite a nice living on it.
Right, and again, another giant area where there's not enough information, and hopefully more and more people will get on this and start gathering more information and doing some great writing about it. I really appreciate you taking such a close read, and thank you so much for the interview. This was a lot of fun.
Oh, no, I thank you for the time. I enjoyed it, and thank you for the work. And whatever you're going to do next, I hope you'll have time to come back on the show, because just from a journalistic perspective, you really, really did a good job on this. I mean, it's also staying within the bounds of being able to finish a book. Because you could have it could have been your life's work, and you could have done it for another 20 years. So it's really good. Congratulations on this. I hope it does spectacular for you. I look forward to whatever you're going to come out with next.
Thanks so much, Adam. I'll talk to you soon.
You bet.